Starbucks was hemorrhaging customers and nobody had answers. Same store transactions had declined for 4 consecutive quarters. Mobile orders were backing up so badly that customers were walking out the door without their drinks, which is a sentence that should not be possible to write about the company that invented the modern American coffee shop experience. The brand was being described in analyst reports using words like broken and directionless, and every competitor in the coffee industry was watching quietly to see what would happen next. Then Starbucks did something no coffee chain operating at its scale had ever been willing to attempt, and the person they hired to do it had never worked a single day in the coffee industry. What Starbucks actually built. Most people think they know this story. Howard Schultz did not found Starbucks. He walked into a small Seattle coffee bean retailer in 1982, fell in love with the idea, bought it from its founders in 1987, and transformed it into something the original founders never intended it to become. What Schultz built was not a coffee company in any traditional sense. It was an environment company that happened to sell coffee as the mechanism for getting people to stay inside it. The concept Schultz came back from Italy describing was called the third place, not home, not work, but the third location in a person's daily life where they spent meaningful time. A European style espresso bar where strangers sat near each other, where the noise level was comfortable rather than aggressive, where you could stay for an hour without anyone counting the minutes. The coffee was not incidental to this vision, it was the reason the transaction made sense and the mechanism that justified the real estate, the seating, and the atmosphere. But the coffee was not the product, the place was the product. That distinction matters enormously for understanding why Starbucks grew the way it did and why what happened to it in the early 2020s was so structurally damaging. Starbucks at its peak was not winning on coffee quality. Specialty coffee shops in most American cities were producing technically superior espresso at comparable or lower price points. Starbucks was winning on consistency, accessibility, and the specific social function the third place concept fulfilled. A customer walking into any Starbucks in any city knew exactly what they would find, exactly how to order it, and exactly how long they could occupy the space without social friction. That predictability was the product underneath the product. By 2019, Starbucks had over 30,000 locations globally. It had built a loyalty program with over 30 million active members in the United States alone. Its mobile ordering app had become one of the most used retail applications in the country. The brand had successfully exported the third place concept to dozens of countries and adapted it to local market conditions with a flexibility that most American chains had never managed. Everything looked like the continuation of a success story that had no obvious reason to stop. The fall nobody saw coming. The mobile order problem did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated the way operational failures usually do, quietly and then suddenly visible everywhere at once. Starbucks introduced mobile ordering in 2015 as a convenience feature for loyal customers who wanted to skip the line. The feature worked beautifully at the transaction volume it was designed for. It stopped working when mobile order volume scaled beyond what the store operations model could absorb, which happened faster and more completely than anyone in leadership appears to have anticipated. By 2022 and into 2023, mobile orders were representing a majority of transactions at many high volume Starbucks locations. The physical store experience for a customer who had placed a mobile order was now the experience of walking into a chaotic pickup area where dozens of drinks sat on a counter in no particular order, where baristas were running against a queue that never seemed to shorten, and where the wait time between order placement and drink availability was routinely longer than the wait time that mobile ordering was supposed to eliminate. The customer who walked in without a mobile order faced a menu board of extraordinary complexity and a staff too occupied with the mobile queue to engage with them in the way the third place concept required. Transaction counts began declining in late 2023, and the decline accelerated through 2024. 4 consecutive quarters of negative same store traffic is not a blip. It is a signal that something structural has changed in the relationship between the brand and the customers who were supposed to be its most reliable base. Starbucks leadership characterized the problem publicly using language that acknowledged operational challenges without fully conveying the severity of the customer experience breakdown that the traffic numbers reflected. The customers who left during this period sorted into identifiable groups that tell different parts of the same story. Occasional customers, people who visited once or twice a month for the experience rather than out of necessity, found that the experience no longer justified the price and the wait and simply stopped coming. Price sensitive customers who had stretched to afford Starbucks as an occasional treat recalculated the value equation and found alternatives that closed the gap more favorably. And the morning commuter customer, who had been one of Starbucks's most reliable and most valuable segments, found that a mobile order placed from the car was producing wait times that no longer fit inside a commute window and began looking for options that could reliably deliver speed without the unpredictability. Laxman Narasimhan, who had been installed as CEO in 2023, was replaced in August 2024. The board's decision to remove him 13 months into his tenure was itself a signal about how seriously the deterioration was being assessed internally. Narasimhan had not caused the operational problems he inherited, but had not demonstrated the ability to reverse them at the pace the board concluded the brand required. The announcement of his departure came on the same day as the announcement of his replacement, which is not how planned leadership transitions are structured. It is how emergency ones are. Brian Niccol walks. Brian Niccol was running Chipotle. He had joined Chipotle in 2018 at the lowest point in the brand's modern history. 18 months after a series of food safety incidents had driven the chain's traffic and stock price to multi-year lows and produced a public trust crisis that most analysts believed would permanently alter the brand's trajectory. Niccol had done something with Chipotle that the analysts who doubted him were still explaining 4 years later. He fixed it, not partially, not approximately. He took a brand in genuine crisis and returned it to a position of strength that the pre-crisis version had never fully achieved. The moves Niccol made at Chipotle are worth understanding as context for what he immediately began doing at Starbucks, because the patterns are not identical, but they rhyme in important ways. At Chipotle, he had focused relentlessly on operational execution, on the physical experience of the restaurant being consistently good rather than occasionally transcendent and frequently disappointing. He had invested in digital ordering while simultaneously ensuring that digital ordering did not degrade the in-restaurant experience for customers who were physically present. He had simplified and then communicated with unusual directness about what the brand was and was not going to be. Niccol walked into Starbucks in September 2024 and published an open letter to customers and employees within his first week that was unusual enough in its specificity to generate genuine attention from people who read corporate communications professionally. The letter acknowledged directly that Starbucks had lost its way. Not that it faced headwinds, not that the environment was challenging, not that there were opportunities to optimize the customer experience, that it had lost its way, and he described in specific terms what that meant and what he intended to do about it. The open letter committed to restoring the coffeehouse experience, to making Starbucks a place where customers felt welcome to sit and stay, to fixing the wait time problem, to simplifying the menu, and to reconnecting baristas with the craft of coffee making rather than the management of an industrial beverage production queue. These commitments are easy to make in a letter. The question that the retail industry, the investment community, and the 47 million people who had stopped visiting as frequently as they once did were all asking simultaneously was whether Niccol could execute them at the scale and speed that Starbucks' situation required. The early signals were specific enough to evaluate seriously. Within his first quarter, Niccol had restructured the leadership team, announced the menu reduction, committed to the 4-minute service standard, reversed several recent policy decisions that had degraded the customer experience, and laid out a financial framework for the turnaround that set expectations, rather than managed them. For a brand that had spent the previous 18 months offering careful and qualified assessments of its own situation, the directness was itself a notable change. The 4-minute promise. No coffee chain serving Starbucks' volume has committed to this, the 4-minute service standard, meaning the time between order placement and drink handoff for all orders, including mobile, is the operational commitment at the center of the entire turnaround strategy, and the one that either makes everything else possible or exposes the other commitments as aspirational rather than executable. 4 minutes sounds simple until you think about what achieving it requires at a location processing hundreds of mobile orders and dozens of in-store orders simultaneously during a morning peak. It requires sufficient staffing levels to handle peak volume without queue backup. It requires equipment capable of producing at the necessary pace without sacrificing consistency. It requires a menu simple enough that the production time per item is predictable and manageable. And it requires a mobile order sequencing system intelligent enough to release orders for production at the right moment relative to the customer's arrival time rather than immediately upon placement, which is how the backup problem built itself in the first place. Starbucks announced significant investment in new equipment across its store network specifically to support the 4-minute standard. The Siren system, an equipment upgrade program that had been in development, was accelerated as part of the turnaround investment. New espresso machines and blending equipment capable of higher throughput were prioritized for high-volume locations where the wait time problem was most acute. This equipment investment is expensive at Starbucks' scale and represents a capital commitment that will take years to fully recover through improved traffic and transaction volume. The staffing component is the most expensive and most difficult piece of the operational puzzle. Adding meaningful labor hours to store schedules at over 9,000 company-operated locations in the United States is a significant ongoing cost that only makes financial sense if the improved experience generates the traffic recovery it is designed to enable. Nickel committed to the staffing investment explicitly, describing it as a necessary precondition for the experience improvement rather than a consequence that would follow from it. That sequencing, invest first and recover through performance, is the opposite of the cost management approach that had been reducing labor hours at high volume locations during the period when the customer experience was deteriorating. The 4-minute promise is either the clearest signal that the turnaround is structurally serious or the commitment most likely to become a visible measure of failure if execution falls short. Starbucks published it publicly, which means customers and analysts now have a specific standard against which every store visit can be measured. That kind of public accountability is unusual for a chain of this size and reflects either genuine confidence in the operational plan or a deliberate willingness to be held to a specific standard as a trust rebuilding mechanism. Possibly both. The menu purge. Starbucks had a menu problem the way some people have a storage unit problem. Things went in and almost nothing came out, accumulating over years until the original purpose of the space became difficult to identify beneath everything that had been added to it. The Starbucks menu at its peak complexity contained over 30 customization combinations per base drink, seasonal items that had become permanent through customer demand and operational inertia, and a beverage architecture so elaborate that a barista hired in 2023 needed significantly more training time to achieve basic competency than one hired in 2005. Nickel announced the elimination of roughly 30% of the menu items in what the company described as a simplification initiative and what regular customers experienced as the removal of specific drinks they had been ordering for years. The internet response was predictable and loud. People who had not been inside a Starbucks since the Bush administration were suddenly very engaged in the specific question of which menu items deserved to survive. The Starbucks subreddit generated more activity in the week the menu cuts were announced than it had in the previous 6 months. Here is why the menu cut is actually the most consequential decision in the entire turnaround, regardless of which items were removed. The menu complexity was a primary driver of the wait time problem. Every additional customization option added to the menu increases the production variance per order, making the average time per drink less predictable and making peak queue management mathematically harder. A simpler menu with fewer items and fewer customization combinations produces more consistent production times, which makes the 4-minute standard achievable rather than aspirational. The menu cut and the 4-minute promise are not independent decisions. They are the same decision described from different directions. The removed items included a portion of the blended beverage lineup, several seasonal drinks that had been held over into the permanent menu, and some of the more elaborate customization options that had become popular through social media, but that added significant production time relative to their sales volume. Starbucks maintained its core seasonal rotation, including the pumpkin spice latte, which at this point is less a coffee drink than a cultural event and will be discontinued approximately never. But the long tail of items that most customers never ordered, but that every barista had to be trained to make, was meaningfully shortened. The customer who lost their specific drink in the purge is genuinely frustrated, and their frustration is legitimate. The brand made something available, built a habit around it, and then removed it for operational reasons that serve the brand's interests more directly than the individual customers. That is a real cost of the simplification strategy, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What Starbucks is betting is that the improvement in the experience for the majority of customers who never ordered the removed items is worth the friction of losing the customers whose habits depended on them. The Sharpie name on the cup. Brian Nichol brought back the Sharpie. This sounds like the least consequential decision in a turnaround strategy that involves billions of dollars in equipment investment and a restructured leadership team. It is not. The decision to return to handwritten customer names on cups, to bring ceramic mugs back for customers drinking in the store, and to restore the condiment bar so customers could add their own milk and sugar rather than requesting it from a barista is the decision that communicates most clearly what Nichol understands about what Starbucks lost and what it needs to recover. The handwritten name on a cup was never about practicality. Mobile ordering handles order management more efficiently than name calling across a pickup counter, and everyone understands that. The handwritten name was a human moment inside a transaction that had become increasingly mechanized. A barista with a Sharpie acknowledging that a specific person was about to receive a specific drink made by a specific human being in a specific location. The moment was small and the sentiment it conveyed was large, and when it disappeared from the mobile order process, something the customer had not consciously valued became noticeable in its absence. The ceramic mug decision is the one that surprised the most people in the industry and that received the most skeptical reception from analysts focused on throughput and transaction efficiency. A ceramic mug in the hands of an in-store customer is a mug that has to be washed, tracked, and managed by staff at a labor cost that disposable cups do not carry. It is a signal that the customer sitting in the store is welcome to be there, that the space was designed for their presence rather than optimized around their departure, and that the third place concept the brand was built on is being reinstated as an operational priority rather than maintained as a nostalgic reference in brand communications. The condiment bar restoration is the simplest of the three decisions and carries a message that the other two reinforce. Trusting the customer to finish their own drink is a gesture of respect. The removal of the condiment bar had been a cost and labor efficiency measure, a reasonable operational decision made by someone optimizing for throughput metrics who did not account for what the removal communicated to the customer about how the brand viewed their presence in the store. Putting it back costs more than removing it saved and does not show up favorably on a per transaction efficiency analysis. It shows up in the customer's experience of whether the store feels like a place they want to be, which is the variable that the efficiency analysis was not measuring. The price problem: Starbucks is expensive, and the price has become harder to defend. A customized grande beverage at Starbucks in most American markets now costs somewhere between $7 and $9, depending on the customization. That price was defensible when the experience consistently delivered the third place value the brand had built its identity around. When the experience deteriorated, the price stayed where it was, and the value equation that customers perform unconsciously on every purchase began returning a different answer. The refill policy became one of the most specific and most discussed points of friction in the customer relationship during the decline period. Starbucks had historically offered free refills on brewed coffee and tea for customers who had purchased a beverage and remained in the store. The policy had been progressively tightened in ways that regular customers noticed and that communicated, whether intentionally or not, that the brand's interest in the customer's extended presence had diminished. Nyquil reversed several of these restrictions as part of the early turnaround moves, restoring a more generous refill policy and explicitly connecting the restoration to the third place recommitment. The Starbucks Rewards program, with over 30 million active members, is simultaneously the brand's most powerful retention asset and one of the clearest indicators of how far customer relationship management had drifted from the experience Schultz's founding vision described. The program had evolved into an elaborate points economy with redemption thresholds and category restrictions that required active management from customers who had originally signed up for a straightforward loyalty experience. Nyquil simplified the program's structure and made earning and redemption more straightforward, reducing the cognitive overhead of participation in ways that the most loyal customers noticed immediately. The price itself has not come down meaningfully and is unlikely to, because the labor investment, equipment investment, and supply chain economics required to execute the turnaround strategy are moving costs upward rather than creating room for price reduction. What Starbucks is attempting is not to compete on price. It is to restore the experience quality that made the price defensible in the first place, which is a more difficult argument to make to a customer who has spent the last 2 years feeling like they were paying a premium for a deteriorating experience. The argument only becomes credible when the experience actually improves consistently enough that the customer stops making the calculation every time they approach the counter. The competitor problem. Dutch Bros deserves serious attention before evaluating the ceiling of what the Starbucks turnaround can actually achieve. Dutch Broilers opened its first drive-through coffee stand in Grants Pass, Oregon in 1992, and went public in 2021 with a growth trajectory and customer satisfaction profile that the coffee industry had not seen from a challenger brand in a generation. It has expanded to over 900 locations and is adding stores at a rate that reflects genuine strategic conviction rather than opportunistic expansion. Dutch Bros competes on speed, staff friendliness, and a beverage menu calibrated precisely for younger customers who represent the most contested demographic in specialty coffee. Its drive-through format eliminates the third place dynamic entirely and serves a customer who has decided the coffee shop as a social environment matters less than a fast, friendly, enjoyable transaction at a price that feels fair. That customer is not who Howard Schultz was designing for in 1987. In 2024 and 2025, that customer represents an enormous and growing segment of the coffee market. Black Rock Coffee Bar, 7 Brew, and a collection of regional drive-through specialty chains have built real businesses on the same fundamental insight Dutch Bros identified and validated first. The drive-through coffee market has developed a competitive ecosystem that Starbucks' format and positioning do not naturally address. Because Starbucks built its identity around the in-store experience, and the drive-through was always an accommodation rather than the core offer. Winning customers back from Dutch bros requires Starbucks to deliver something the drive-through format structurally cannot, which is exactly what the third place restoration is attempting to represent. Independent specialty coffee has claimed a different and perhaps more permanently lost slice of the former Starbucks customer base. The customer who moved from Starbucks to an independent specialty shop left because they became more interested in coffee quality than brand consistency. And independent specialty coffee offers a quality ceiling that Starbucks' operational model at 36,000 locations cannot realistically reach. Nickel has not positioned winning back specialty coffee enthusiasts as a turnaround priority, which is an honest read of where Starbucks' competitive advantages actually exist and where they do not. The customers available for recovery are the ones who left because the experience broke, not the ones who left because they outgrew what Starbucks was built to be. Whether any of it works, this question deserves to be asked without a predetermined answer embedded in the framing. Turnaround narratives are appealing, and the coffee industry extends more goodwill to a compelling comeback story than most sectors. Brian Nichol is an exceptional retail executive with a documented track record that earns genuine credibility for the strategy he has laid out. None of that makes the outcome certain, and several of the variables that will determine whether this works are not within Starbucks' direct control. Early data from the first quarters of Nichol's tenure showed stabilization in the traffic decline, followed by early signs of recovery in select markets. The same-store transaction declines that had persisted for 4 consecutive quarters began improving after the turnaround initiatives reached sufficient scale to be measurable. Analysts who follow the brand closely are reading the stabilization as a genuine signal rather than noise. Stabilization is not recovery, and recovery is not a return to peak. But the direction changed, and the direction changing is the prerequisite for everything else that has to follow. Menu simplification is showing measurable improvement in wait times at locations where the implementation is complete, which is the most direct confirmation that the operational diagnosis was correct. If the improvement sustains and expands across the full network, the 4-minute standard moves from a public commitment toward operational reality, and the price defense becomes an argument the experience actually supports, rather than one the marketing has to carry alone. The risk that concerns the most serious skeptics is execution consistency at scale. Nicol turned Chipotle around when the chain operated approximately 2,500 locations. Starbucks operates over 36,000 globally, including over 9,000 company-operated stores in the United States. The organizational complexity of driving consistent execution change across that footprint is not just larger than what Chipotle required. It is qualitatively different in ways that linear scaling does not capture. Communication chains lengthen, management layers multiply, cultural alignment requirements compound. Strategies that work at 2,500 locations sometimes fail at 9,000, not because they were wrong, but because the organization required to implement them at that scale does not yet exist and has to be built while the turnaround is already running. Here is what this story is actually about underneath the coffee. Starbucks is attempting to answer a question that every scaled consumer brand eventually faces, and that most of them answer badly. The question is whether a brand that grew by delivering a specific human experience can hold that experience as an operational priority once the scale of the business creates financial pressure to treat the experience as a cost to be managed rather than a product to be protected. The mobile order backup was not a technology failure. It was what happens when a brand optimizes for transaction volume without maintaining the experience quality that makes the transaction worth completing. Every individual efficiency decision that contributed to the deterioration made local sense on a spreadsheet. The condiment bar removal saved labor. Reduced staffing saved payroll. Menu expansion increased average ticket. Each decision was rational in isolation. Collectively, they dismantled the thing the business was actually selling, one reasonable quarterly decision at a time. Nickel's turnaround is a specific bet that investing in the experience before the financial metrics justify it will generate the customer recovery that eventually does justify it. That bet worked once at a smaller brand under different competitive conditions with a different category of trust crisis to overcome. Whether it works here at this scale, in this environment, with this much accumulated customer frustration to reverse is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the nature of what Starbucks attempted. It admitted publicly that it had broken something. It replaced the person managing the decline with someone whose job was to end it. It made specific and measurable commitments about what the experience would become. And it began spending money on the experience before the experience had earned that investment. That sequence is rare enough in American retail at this scale to be worth watching carefully until the answer is clear.